All right, Rupa, welcome to the Psych Guys podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's an honor. It's a really good setup here too, so I'm impressed.
Right.
It is a professional studio after all.
Yeah. Studio day. Well, I guess I'm not going to give my location. That'd be weird. But yeah, we're stoked to have you here. We're going to record 2 episodes with you. And the first topic we're going to talk about is super challenging, in my opinion. I think all of us have personal experience with this. We're going to talk about healthcare workplace violence. And all of us obviously work in a psychiatric realm. We're all psychiatry residents. You're a second-year psychiatry resident here at our program. So yeah, let's start it off with, I guess my first question to you, Rupa, is why did you want to talk about this today?
I think it's something that, in my experience, in my 1 year of experience, it's just not talked about enough. Mm-hmm. I think there's also, it's very easy to get comfortable on the psych ward. You kind of get into complacency and we kind of let our guards down. So I think, just to always be mindful about the actual risk that we have in our field and constantly being reminded about it is important. And then starting up those conversations of how we can how do we defend ourselves, but also how we ask administration for help and support in our endeavors on the psych ward. So
I think that was well said. One of the things that really stood out to me is this concept of complacency. I think just by the virtue of being in an inpatient psychiatric unit, day after day after day, week after week, you just kind of lose the perception that there is actually a risk for real violence, for people to get hurt. And I think, it was on my heart to want to do this episode because, like you said, I think we all need to step back and be reminded of the potential dangers, because it is a fact that workplace violence is on the rise. We're going to be discussing it in terms of the psychiatric setting, especially in terms of inpatient units and maybe even the emergency departments. But it is a fact that workplace violence is on the rise in all different professions. And that is one of the issues that we want to highlight on this episode. So I think this is a great place to start. I'm going to read you guys something that I found in my research. So, according to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, hospitals are one of the most dangerous workplaces in the United States. You guys heard that before?
No, but it does kind of shock me.
Why does it shock you?
I think because we always think of a hospital as a safe place. Everyone's kind of taking care of each other. And I'd like to believe that, maybe I'm biased, that the hospital is, a sanctuary, and that it's just a place where people take care of each other. So imagining, in the regular hospital, irrespective of being in the psychiatric, like a hospital or the unit, I've never really felt unsafe.
That's interesting. So I'm going to throw some numbers out at you, Rupa.
Okay.
Maybe challenge those perceptions a little bit more. So I actually read that 1 in 4 ED nurses actually are victims of violence in the workplace. So that is a very significant number. I mean, 1 in 4, that's a lot. I mean, these are people who have a good heart, right? I don't think anybody goes into the medical profession, let alone an environment like the emergency department, given all their challenges and the complexity and the acuity of the cases that they take care of, without the desire to help their fellow man, right? And I think it's unfortunate, especially when you take the context that healthcare professionals are in shortage all over the United States. That's especially true when we look at psychiatric settings, but healthcare in general. We need more good people. We need people with heart for patient care. We need people that are willing to go the extra miles for the patients that they take care of. And we need to foster a system where we're encouraging individuals and saying, hey, this is a great environment to work in. This is a job where you can find a lot of contentment, where you can do a ton of good. And I worry with the escalation in violence, especially in the hospital settings, that it may be an impediment to that ultimate goal. So if it's okay with you guys, I'd like to play a little game of trivia. All right. I got some numbers. I'm going to throw some questions out at you.
Okay.
All right. Number 1, violence against healthcare workers is blank times higher than the rest of the professions in the United States.
Oh, I guess compared to all professions?
Yes.
I might say 10, I guess.
I think I'll say 10 too.
10 times? Wow, you guys are close.
Well, I mean, look, I used to be an insurance agent. like that's like 100, like boy, I don't know, but I guess then when we factor in professions like, the police, that I would hope is in some regard higher than a healthcare worker, but I mean, it has to be, right? But I don't know. So what is it?
All right. So the answer is violence against healthcare workers is 12 times higher than the rest of the United States.
I can't believe I shorted that. Wow.
Yeah. Well, you guys came pretty close. I thought you guys were going to say maybe like 2 times, 3 times. That's kind of what I was thinking.
I mean, I've been cheating this whole time and I looked at it. I actually did guess. Yeah. So, wow. I mean, and I guess what I would though push against that in some regard, when I was researching this for this episode, I didn't really find the historical trends. So I'm actually excited to learn, excited in a sad way, like how this has changed with time. Because one of the things I was looking at was this meta-analysis, and it was saying, okay, well, what is the definition of violence against healthcare workers? And it was like immediately in our mind, we just think of like physical assault, of course. But it was describing here like, okay, do those calculations also include verbal violence, sexual assault, harassment, like verbal sexual assault? That doesn't necessarily include physical sensations, right? But that can absolutely still be traumatizing in many ways to these healthcare workers. So did you find when you referenced that stat earlier, were you specifically referring to physical violence?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is I don't know. The article just mentioned that it's violence against healthcare workers, right? So that's a great question. What exactly do they mean? What exactly do they classify as violence? I don't have a good answer for you, Logan, but whatever the classification is, it's being equated across all the different professions equally. There's an equal standard, and it just shows that healthcare professionals are at 12 times the risk compared to the general population. Right. So that's pretty significant. If you want to play another one, here's number 2 for you. What blank percentage of all workplace violence incidents that happen each year in the United States involve healthcare professionals?
Let's go 40.
40%.
I'm going to go 50.
50%.
Just, the round
The answer
numbers.
is 75% of all workplace violence incidents that happen each year in the U.S. involves healthcare professionals.
Wow.
3 and 4.
Yeah, it's things like that you don't really think about. When you immediately go into this career, my wife is still considering a profession in this career, and it's one of the things we talk about. It's like, this career of course can be rewarding, but working from home as a software engineer, you don't have to think about those kind of things. My previous career in finance, I never ever thought about these kind of things, right? And I in some ways, this is always a weird topic for me to talk about, just violence and mental illness. I'm not saying every single one of those instances of violence necessarily involved mental illness, but probably some did, right? Because I started this work, this advocacy, this online, whatever the hell you want to call it, and releasing my thoughts into the internet sphere, started after the Sandy Hook shooting, right? And that Sandy Hook shooting, for the listeners who don't know, was when that person went into that elementary school in Connecticut and shot teachers, children. It was horrific. It came out that this individual had mental illness. I remember at that time in my life, this was probably 2012, I think. I don't remember exactly the date, so forgive me. But that's what compelled me, because I always feel really passionate that mental illness gets an unfair association with violence. Like, I think that there's, of course, a stigma there, and that's why I wanted to speak out, because I don't consider myself a violent person. But also, like, the risk is not zero, too. And I feel like I always kind of knew that going into this field of psychiatry. And that's kind of the spiel I give to medical students when they're, maybe their first experience with people who are severely mentally ill. It's like, hey, look, there is an element of unpredictability here, and you do have to kind of have like this spidey sense and just be a little bit on guard. And I think that's one of the true challenges, right, I feel like of being really compassionate with patients is there has to be certain barriers. You mentioned earlier, Rupa, like, how did you describe it? I call it like being cowboy, like cavalier, I think. Is that what you said? Complacent,
yeah.
Some C word. I think of like, I was like a cowboy, I feel like, as an intern. And what I mean by that is I didn't think necessarily always about the risks of violence. And I put myself one time too close to a patient who was extremely agitated, and I did get attacked. I had like bruises on my arm. It was a really weird, traumatic experience for me, and I can kind of get into that, later in this episode. But it was just odd, and ever since that instance, I have radically changed my approach to patients, because I want to help patients as much as I can, but I need to keep myself safe at all costs.
How do you feel now looking back? Do you feel like your quality of care was decreased because now you're a little bit more on your spidey sense?
No. I think that, sadly, some of it was maybe the hospital financial motive, because when we perform exams on patients, you're supposed to cover 5 out of 8 systems in the physical exam. And so on every single patient, I was always listening to heart and lungs, or palpating if necessary. Now I've really tried to accompany this or embody this role as the psychiatrist. It's like, okay, are you breathing? Are you able to talk to me without it hurting your chest? Okay, let's like sit here and just chill and really try to connect with each other as humans. And I think like the biggest thing I've really changed is like my physical distancing with patients. Like we're not hugging. We'll shake hands, we'll bump fists and stuff, but like I draw a firm boundary there. Like, I am not hugging patients. I am only going to do physical exams if I truly feel it's clinically warranted, and the patient has to be in a good place too to be able to manage that physical exam.
Yeah, I only asked that because when I was reading, I saw that with the higher workplace violence that organizations are facing, quality of patient care has been seen to go down. There's a lower threshold for IMing or restraining patients. I'm sure across all inpatient facilities, we start seeing, a very easy trigger finger to be like, oh, let's just Haldol someone, and then where does that line, and I understand from the staff's perspective of wanting to be safe, but where do we start teetering that line of like, now it's truly, self-fulfilling thought of like the patients that they're in a jail, right? Like that is a very, I think, a line that I've always kind of thought about in that respect, right? Like patients already come into the unit kind of on high guard, thinking that we're going to take away their rights, or we're not going to listen to them, or we're just going to assume that they're crazy. And then we do, out of defense, tend to, restrain patients chemically or physically, or, I think I can imagine students, maybe like medical students, not being comfortable going on to like an involuntary side because of the horror stories that they hear, or like, the unpredictability that you talked about. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how much of us not even knowing when we interact with patients, how much did it change? How much did the way we interact with patients change? Because there's going to be a lot of social cues, right? Maybe we're not making as much eye contact, even like little gestures that we're not even noticing, and that are making the patients feel more other, and not more like, one of us kind of thing. Does that make sense?
No, and I think you bring up a good point, because I feel like when I answered that question, I was purely thinking of my personal experience. Did it compromise my personal experience? And at first it really did. I was not into psychiatry in a sense after I got attacked. Like fuck this career. Like, why did I do this? This wasn't worth this experience. Like, I could have just stayed in finance and had a cush life. Definitely went through that, and actually met with a therapist over time and kind of learned to reinvigorate my passion for psychiatry. Now, that being said, I wonder how the patients would necessarily perceive my compassion in a sense from their perspective, because I think you brought up some things that I think maybe I did actually change my attitude. Whereas, when I was initially Cowboy Logan, intern Logan, thought I could talk every patient down off a cliff, I definitely lean, I feel like, on medicine more now than I did when I was younger. And I feel I do that for safety reasons for myself and my staff. But, from the perspective of the patient, has that experience influenced my threshold for using the needle, right? The intramuscular medicine? Probably. Yeah, I think that actually is a fair result of that experience. Or I don't know if fair is the right word, but definitely a result.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Joon, from your experiences?
Well, I think, the sense that I'm getting here is it seems to be like we're in a constant battle, unfortunately, with our patients. We're always tugging and pulling, trying to figure out the best balance between providing adequate care, but also keeping everybody safe. And all it takes is one incident, right, to completely change your perspective, right? Like if you were assaulted by a patient in a very, very, very severe way, I mean, I've heard people, we've all heard of cases where the assault was so bad that the victim doesn't come back to work. Right. They actually leave the mental health field. And I think that's just...
Maybe even further than that. In medicine, period.
Right.
Yeah.
Medicine, period. Yeah. And I mean, one is, given the severity of certain circumstances, like I completely understand.
Right.
And I think it's just such a tragedy at the end of the day because we have such a shortage of mental health care professionals. And it's an unfortunate part of our jobs that we have to be vigilant and mindful that there is this very real risk of violence. But at the same time, how do we maintain our empathy and how do we maintain our positive outlook that can kind of help us persevere doing this job year after year? So I think those are very interesting questions to think about and reflect on. But that brings me to another point. We actually watched a video recently, and it's something that I been wanting to show you. So this is a video that Rupa actually sent me a couple of days ago.
Oh, okay.
And it describes such an experience in an inpatient psychiatric unit. And I think we can have a fantastic discussion on it. I think we can, there's a lot of areas where we can provide our insight from being in that kind of setting for the vast majority of these past 2 years for myself and Logan, and the past year for Rupa. So Rupa, let's show Logan that little TikTok.
TikTok. By the way, if you want to watch our TikTok videos, you can go on Okay, wait, sorry. Focus, Logan. Focus. Okay, wait. Turn this up. Okay.
46-year-old nurse Rena Ortega was alone in a room processing in a new patient to the Elgin Mental Health Center when authorities say the man attacked her. An occurrence so common in hospitals there is a name for it, Code Gray. But on July 17th, by the time the Code Gray was sounded summoning help, Nurse Ortega had been beaten nearly to death.
That's one of our biggest fears, is that what if something happens? We are solely in the room with the patient alone.
That did happen here at the Elgin Mental Health Center nearly 3 weeks ago when authorities say this man, Travis Turner, at 6'3" and 196 pounds, began attacking the petite-sized nurse who was registering him into the system. Rena Ortega was severely beaten with injuries to her face, skull, and upper body, life-threatening injuries, according to prosecutors, who have now charged 18-year-old Turner with attempted first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated battery.
We cannot only look at the fact that it's a person at a mental health facility. We have to look at the totality of the circumstances. And for us, especially because she received these injuries that were life-threatening, it was important to us that we bring the charges that fit this crime.
Ortega was photographed by our news partner, the Daily Herald, at her nursing school graduation in 2013, honoring her then recently deceased mother. Tonight, Nurse Ortega is still hospitalized with critical wounds.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that's powerful, and like the ultimate fear I feel like of healthcare workers, unless even further than that, being actually killed, right? Man, I mean that was tough to watch. I feel like that's my first reaction to it, right? It's that like visceral, nauseating reaction. And it's like, yeah, man, how can we mitigate against that? Like we need to step up as clinicians, as all of us are doctors. We're going to be the leaders of these kind of institutions. Like what kind of changes would you want to see, Rupa, that you think could maybe most mitigate against those kind of horrific events?
It's such a, heavy question, Logan, because I don't think there is anything that I think the solution has to be multifaceted. I think in general, administration needs to not worry so much about financial cost of how we're going to make our workplaces just even physically safe. But also just kind of listen to the complaints of, listen to the actual worries about their workers. So what I mean first is, making sure that the unit, any psychiatric unit, is properly, constructed in a way that every room has 2 doors of escape, like egress and regress, right? There is facilities that I know that were turned over from old medical units that were turned into psychiatric beds that are not designed to have safety plans where the rooms are designed that like the patient has one place where they can escape from and then everyone else and their staff can get away from. That's problem number 1, right? That is an administration problem. That is an infrastructure problem that should be, at the very least, be number 1, that we should make our setting safe. Second is that, I think there is a tendency maybe to sugarcoat the danger of the workplace, especially to people that are getting hired, right? So one of the articles that I read is that workplace violence makes it very difficult to retain nurses. So there's always high turnover. Right. And when you're in desperate need of nurses, I feel like you tend to maybe sugarcoat the actual danger that might be there, and what exists, and like really lay it out to people that this is what can happen. You might have a 6'3" individual coming after you who might have a psychotic break, right? I've heard arguments that, we need to, because of like just discrimination laws and all that, we can't just hire, techs that are male, and
you need to be able to bench 250 for this.
Yeah, so we can't do that.
I heard that argument as well. Like that's like a legal discrimination thing that you can't be as explicit like that.
Yeah, and then like what frustrates me is that I hear pregnant, petite, young techs like doing one-to-ones on some of the most aggressive patients, right? And that's not unique to one facility. How do we? I don't want to advocate for discriminating any nurse that wants to get hired, but there has to be more transparency, because it's very difficult for me to believe that if you fully told someone that this is the danger on an involuntary side, a 5'3" pregnant lady is going to be like, okay, let me be the one-to-one tech for this very aggressive patient. And I'm sure there's a space in the unit where she could go to maybe a less aggressive patient. And that comes down to having enough staff that there is freedom to do that, to kind of move around our nurses and our techs in a way that like it's not so severely dependent that we only have one tech and that one tech is going to the most aggressive patient. Those are things I think that, administration across the board has to be very mindful about.
I think we need to take a step back and realize like we're talking about workplace violence kind of a whole this episode. We don't want to get into any like identifiers of when and where we've experienced violence, and realize like all these stats that we're referencing, and Joon referenced that stat of raising rates, and I'm sure you have your own stats too. Like there have been security guards even on units where this place has occurred. I wonder, that video you guys showed me, if there was a guard on that unit too.
Yeah.
That video unfortunately sounds like, at least to me, it sounds like it was a smaller lady who was in a room without a way to escape. Unfortunately, that was trapped in a room.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to piggyback on what you were talking about, Rupa, because this is one of my biggest frustrations, right? We know that the safest way to position yourself in a room is so that essentially that you have access to the door, right? So you essentially want to position yourself between the patient and the door. But the problem with that, and the counter argument to that, is if you're between the patient and the door, that can lead to a position where the patient feels they're in an unsafe environment. So the most common suggestion that I hear being thrown out is that patients and clinicians should sit in such a way that they can both easily exit through the door. Yeah. Right? So that would be one. But ideally, what we want to see happen is we want to see these rooms designed specifically for safety. Right? We want to see a room where maybe there's an exit on both sides of the room. Yeah. And the patient and the clinician can both sit by a door without having their exits blocked. How common is that in a psychiatric inpatient facility? I'm going to be honest. I've never seen a facility designed that way, unfortunately. And who knows? That's my limited experience. There might be a ton of them out there. But the point here is that my frustration is that there's no standardization in how these mental health inpatient facilities are designed. And I wonder why, because we do recognize with all these incidents that's happening and the media that is getting in social and the attention that it's getting within social media, that the propensity for violence, for especially healthcare workers to experience violence in this kind of setting, is very, very real. And given that this is a setting where we need more kind-hearted individuals to help take care of those people that are most in need, it just paints a picture where it's difficult for everybody that's involved, right? Yeah. And I feel like one of the systemic changes that could happen is we need clear regulations on how these inpatient facilities are designed. We need these facilities to be designed with patient and staff safety first. And we talked about this a lot on this podcast, right? It's not just about safety. You know, when it comes to the design of these hospitals, they have bland walls. I mean, essentially bare bones, like there's nothing there and you don't have any of your belongings. So like, why not more windows? Why not more vibrant colors? And there's so many things that we can do to at least create a better physical space that's more conducive to healing and harmony. But unfortunately, with the way our healthcare system is structured today, at least that's not the reality today. I hope that one day in the future, it could be. And I hope conversations like this is the first step to achieving that goal.
Yeah. I mean, I like that point you made about kind of like trying to create like a standard. That's why, I mean, look, I don't want to get too much into politics, but I do think like a single payer structure approach to healthcare could be better, because at the end of the day, in my honest opinion, it's like you can't run a typical psychiatry inpatient ward well with profit in mind, right? And just like trying to burn and churn, get as much revenue as possible, you know, focusing on quality. One thing I'm kind of learning about healthcare as a whole is that psychiatry is typically a loss leader at the hospital. Typically, it does not generate revenue for the hospital, but hospitals are required by law to have this kind of thing. So I think we just need to admit that, like, look, the psychiatry units can't be run like the way they need to be and actually necessarily turn that profit, that growth that the hospital always sees. I think we need to really kind of advocate for that, you know, maybe if we can improve staffing ratios, the structures of these rooms to set them up in a safer way is so important. Both of you guys have already said that. I'm not going to repeat the same thing necessarily. But I also think it's really trying to be more creative and intentional with the space, like the colors you touched upon. But my even personal experience in a psych ward when I was a patient, and very much like a lot of the psych wards we work at, you don't even get a chance to go outside. There's no access to exercise. Like, so if you have this pent up anger, this aggression, this frustration that it's like, I'm fucking locked in this place. This sucks. Let me out. A lot of patients voice that same thing to us. I wish we could have some modality to get that kind of energy out. And when I'm thinking of, you know, you were there, Rupa, whenever that was, a couple of weeks ago or last week, we took a self-defense class at this Taekwondo mixed martial arts place. And so they had all these like heavy bags you can kick, punch, just go as hard as you want on. I think a lot about like, what if we could have a de-escalation aggression room, just where you put on boxing gloves, you just like, there's a heavy bag, you just go nuts, get all that energy out. I really wonder, would that lead to less administration of intramuscular medicine, less incidents of actual workplace violence on a person, which like, dude, go punch the punching bag. I know you're pissed off at the world. Don't punch anybody, but go punch the punching bag. Like, let it all out. Go hard. Like, you know, burning all those calories for 30 minutes. Like, I think it's hard to be, in a sense, knock on wood, plastic, as agitated after that. I don't know. What do you guys think? Am I just talking out of my ass here?
I think there's definitely creative ways that are untapped. You know, we did that defense class and I even walked away feeling great after that. Mm-hmm. I think that...
What'd you learn? What'd you learn at the defense class that made you feel so great?
I think I was equipped with that feeling of like, listen, I have had these moves now. And even if it's placebo, you feel a little bit more confident in how... you know in the back of your mind that you could get yourself out of a situation, or even just a little bit better, right? I've you know, luckily haven't been in this experience, but I'd like to think that I'd be a kind of fight, kind of, if I was in that situation, I would, you know, run away or something like that. But I can also see myself just kind of getting, you know, just staying there and freezing if you know, a patient was ever coming to me or anything. But having that defense class just showed me that like, if, you know, we kind of did mock things of like someone coming at us, like I'm a little bit more equipped to maybe be able to escape if I was in that situation. I think when we talk about the standardization, I definitely think having like these self-defense courses, and, you know, people coming in telling us like exactly what we can do and what moves we can do that are like protects us from the hospital and like, you know, lawsuits and everything. I think that's super important too. Because I think, you know, just a module online isn't going to really teach us how to protect ourselves. I think it has to be kind of like an in-person demonstration of like moves that you can do, like easy moves, right? Like one of the moves that we learned was like always, if someone grabs your wrist, you try to just like release your wrist from the side where the thumb is, because, you know, it's only the thumb there versus the other side would be have 4 fingers. And I never thought that, right? You can escape like someone's hold very quickly if you do that. So I think that was one of the fun things about that defense class. And I'm glad that, you know, our program afforded that opportunity. And then I agree with Logan. There's so many untapped ways of, you know, kind of helping patients and letting them express what they need to express, right? Seeing them for 15 minutes, asking them how they slept and all that kind of stuff isn't going to be as therapeutic as I think we can be. And I've seen, you know, on TikTok, where I get a lot of information, I've seen psych wards in, you know, different countries, like a lot of European countries where patients are able to use their phone for a certain amount of time. You know, I've seen video diaries of people in the psych ward saying like, this is what I'm doing today. This is how my day was. And that could just be their creative outlet, you know, their connection to the outside world. And they can feel like they're not just caged up. So there's definitely a lot of untapped potential and solutions we haven't even, I guess, considered. But I guess also at the same time, I will be fair and say that, you know, sometimes we have to deal with a more acute situation of just, decreasing the amount of workplace violence and finding like more basic kind of solutions before we can tap into those like extra creative kind of solutions. You know?
I agree with you there, Rupa. I mean, I don't think there's ever a shortage of the potential ideas that we can have to improve safety for our healthcare workers and ultimately improve care for our patients. But I do want to backtrack a little bit because you said something very interesting that I picked up on. You said defense, and then you also threw out runaway, right?
Yeah.
So to me, those two things are kind of different, and I'm going to explain why. My biggest fear, if I was to ever get attacked in a hospital setting, is if I defend myself too well, at what point when the administration is reviewing the case, when they're looking at that event a day later from a little camera that's on the wall, they're and they're just taking basically Monday morning quarterbacking, right? And they're reviewing the events that happened. At what point does defense look like you're trying to hurt the patient?
Right.
Because I have seen certain cases where staff members were disciplined and even let go because they intervened a little bit too aggressively to a patient's agitation or act of violence. So that's always what I have in the back of my mind. And to this day, I have not gotten a good answer for that. So unfortunately, if I was to ever get attacked by a patient and I don't have any other options, if I can't run away, I think given the fact that I'm a resident, given the fact that I have hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loans that I need to pay off, given that I've spent over a decade at this point pursuing this profession, that's a lot to risk.
Yeah.
It's a lot to risk. So I think I'll probably just get beat up, probably go into fetal position, just get kicked on a little bit. And I feel like in a way, I mean, of course, physically, the risks are higher, but if I just extrapolate out and kind of think about what is going to be the most detrimental to my life, I almost feel like if I did defend myself and, who knows what can happen in that moment when you have your adrenaline pumping, who knows how you're going to react? Who knows? Like you meant to just push the patient off and it may have come out in a different way and you don't even realize it until you look at it on the computer screen the next day. So who knows how things could turn out? So I always have that fear. And I feel like that fear is just as real as being attacked by a patient.
Yeah, I mean, that's tough because it's like, even in my personal experience of being attacked, I know you witnessed an attack, Rupa, recently, sadly. it's hard. It's like, what was I thinking in the moment? It's like, I don't even know. Everything happened so fast, right? It's hard to really know exactly. And like, can we make sound decisions in a state of heightened, like sympathetic fight or flight, like literally just wildness, right? So I think I think both parts are important, right? Preparing. In some ways, it's almost like we need to anticipate that something like this can happen in your career, right? And so maybe taking those defense classes ahead of time is super important. But I also think that afterwards is equally as important. One thing I did that I'm really proud of is I did access the employee assistance program that my hospital did offer, which was cool. And there was like some other program that the hospital offered. I can't even remember what it was, but it was like acute stress workplace shit. I don't know. Some nurse talked to me and it was very nice. And sadly, she actually shared a similar experience. She was like, I was attacked. And like, that's why I have this role at the hospital. It's like, I help. Sadly, like there's a role at the hospital for that person, as kind of crazy as it is. But at least, if you're out there listening and you've witnessed something like this, if you've gone through something like this, I think acknowledging that it is extremely, extremely challenging and accessing some kind of mental health resources, I think the best and easiest place to start is the one that your company should be paying for, that stupid employee assistance program. I shouldn't call it stupid. It's amazing. I think good things about it. And if not there, then accessing whatever means you can to try to get help right away.
Yeah. And I think also a lot of the times is having an open dialogue with your colleagues. I think sometimes we don't talk about things enough. But I think we find that the same fears that we have are shared amongst a lot of our peers. And I think knowing and not feeling isolated and knowing that, those views are shared and having a collaborative communication is so, at least for me, was very therapeutic after witnessing, an incident at work. So I think when everyone came together, I think that's the best way to kind of advocate for change. And luckily we had, a good response. So in terms of like how I felt supported, I'll say that, to be fair.
I'm gonna respectfully disagree. Well, okay, look. Here's my 2 cents. It's
different though. I wasn't the one attacked.
Right.
So,
right. But like, what I always think a lot about in this thing, if you guys are just audio listeners out there, like, look, I'm 6 foot. I weighed 237 pounds this morning. Like, I'm a pretty big person. Not all psychiatry residents or healthcare workers in this are built like me. And so I always think about my colleagues who are, let's say, like smaller than me, right? Like, what are their emotions? What are their experiences? I actually want a future episode. I wanted to interview Michaela Margolis, our colleague, and she's a very small person. Like, what is it like that? And how is that kind of experience different? Like, when you guys were researching this, I'm curious, like, I found risk factors for violence towards healthcare workers, but I almost wonder, like, are healthcare workers who are more petite, who are small, or maybe of like female gender, are they more susceptible to violence? I would sadly assume so.
Yeah, but I also think I'll give the caveat from the female perspective in the room is that I am a little bit more on guard. I trust my gut a lot more than I think maybe some of my male counterparts will. Also, it's a dialogue at my home. Be safe, have your guard up. Our program director actually had told me very early on, she was like, we think that we can predict people's behavior, but we're the worst predictors of it. Right. So I kind of keep that in my mind, in the back of my mind. I am a young female. I recently, injured my knee. I'm walking around with a knee brace on the unit. So my head's always on a swivel. So I don't know if that's just, maybe we don't think it's not the forefront for you, Logan, at that time, or before it wasn't, because
that's a good point.
And I'll give my input here too. I think I'm going to qualify myself as being on the smaller side. I'm 5'7", 155 pounds on a good day.
It's not the size of the dog. It's the size of the fight in that dog, right, Jen?
I ain't got no fight. Like I said, I'm getting kicked on. Right.
He literally said fetal position, Logan.
Yeah, fetal position. I got it all planned out.
I mean, he talks this now, but I've seen him on the basketball court.
Okay.
All right. So, look, I love inpatient psychiatry. Even though we've basically spent the past 30 minutes talking about how dangerous it can be and some of the unfortunate events that happen there, I think it's a place where you can meet patients at their time of most need, and you can intervene for them. I've seen people come in one condition and leave a completely different person. And I do really believe that it's a place, given all its faults and given all the potential areas that we can improve on, it's still a place where there's real healing involved, and people do leave a lot of the times with positive benefit. And it makes me feel like all this was worth it to help somebody, you know, in that way, to intervene for them acutely in that sort of manner. So I'm always at a conflict between, you know, chasing something that I'm passionate about and weighing that with the potential for violence, and where I've kind of landed on, you know, and who knows what kind of job I'll take once I graduate. But if I'm taking a job in an inpatient psychiatric hospital or even the emergency department, and these are the two most areas where patients are the most decompensated, they're the most in what we will call a crisis state, right? So the risk for violence is understandably the highest in those settings. And these are both settings that I love taking care of patients in. And I am seriously considering a future career in both of these settings. But I think I would like it to be remote. I want to do it virtually. And I know there's so many problems with virtual patient evaluations. There's so many technological issues that can happen. There's so many frustrations. And look, patients oftentimes don't enjoy the virtual telehealth experience. And I understand all of that. I'm going to be honest, I myself don't really enjoy it either. There's always an issue of, you know, just being there with another human being, being able to perceive their emotions and just using your emotional intelligence to guide your interview. You do lose a lot of that in a virtual setting. But like I said, I also have a commitment to my family, you know, to come back home, you know, safe. And I want to be doing this job for a long time. And all it takes is one incident. And look, it's just so random. Like, who knows? We hear about things happening to other people, but it could be any one of us. Right. And you never know. All it takes is one time. So just because I have that fear, and because I am a smaller guy, I feel like most, you know, look, on average, I'm smaller than the average person. So it makes sense that when we're in the inpatient psychiatric hospital, a lot of the patients are a lot bigger than me. So that is at the back of my mind. If this person really put his mind to it, he can probably pin me up against the wall and I can't do anything about it. Yeah. Right. So if I ever work in a setting like this, and like I said, I love these settings, I think I would seriously consider doing it on a remote only basis. And with that said, I want to ask you guys, like, how often? Okay, so we've all spent significant amounts of time in inpatient hospitals, patient psych hospitals, and emergency departments. So let's give the audience a little bit perspective, you know, from the insights that we've garnered over the past 2 years. On average, how often do you hear of an incident of violence happening in an inpatient psychiatric unit? What would you say?
How often?
How often?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I looked up these stats across like studies, but I guess in my personal life, that's very hard to answer. I'm not sure because I don't know. Like Rupa said earlier, like sadly, I don't know if it, you know, it's not like we have a group chat about this stuff, right? Yeah. And like there's almost, I feel like these weird clicks right in the psych ward. Like sadly, like I wish I almost interacted with the technicians more, but like the way our roles are and everybody is so busy, like I don't get to talk about their experience. Like I wonder like what things happen that just maybe the technicians always know about, the nurses always know about. Like these channels of communication are definitely not perfect, right? So man, I have no idea. I'm not sure how to answer that.
That's a great point. Maybe we need to bring on a psychiatric technician one of these days, because they have a very difficult job.
They do.
Right.
I mean, we as physicians, right, we evaluate patients and then we can kind of go to our office and put in orders, write our notes, do everything from, you know, a computer.
Yeah.
But other staff members have to be supervising the patients, you know, their entire shift. Mm-hmm. And of course, with increased time that you spend with patients, especially ones that are actively violent or aggressive, the risk for violence occurring, you know, of course, increases. All right, so maybe this question instead then. That video that we watched, it said, one of the things that stood out to me was that these incidents happen so often that there's a name for it. Code Gray.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How often? All right, so Rupa, can you explain to us what exactly Code Gray is and how often does it actually happen in an inpatient psychiatric unit from your experience?
From my experience, I think I've probably heard it around 4 to 5 times in the hospital, even if I wasn't on the unit. So like, just on the medicine floor is kind of hearing it, right? So I think you'd probably be more eloquent in saying what a code gray is and describing it.
Well, it's like security alert. That's what
security
I
alert. Yeah,
like,
just get the
to
security.
hear you say you've only heard it 4 times ever, I'm like, wait, like a month or a week?
Yeah, I was about
to say, like, bro, I've heard that shit fucking twice a week, twice a day.
To be fair,
is it Tuesday or like I don't know. Maybe it's just luck of the draw. We're in different places at different times.
Yeah.
Interesting. You brought up code gray. There was a stat that I looked at. Logan, can you find it? Logan, can you find it?
You can do it, Logan.
Let's go. Okay. It was talking about overall rates of physical incidents. No shock here, I think. There's more physical incidences during evening shift, between 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. versus day shift, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. And this really had me thinking a lot. Like, is this more about the patients? Are patients in a better mood necessarily between 7:30 and 3? I maybe that's definitely part of it. Is there more going on during the day at a lot of these units between 7 and 3? Maybe. And I also even was thinking about, like, I don't know if this is grossly true, but it seems to me anecdotally that the 7 to 3 is a more desirable shift than the 3 to 11. And so I find sometimes, this isn't always true, but sometimes more seasoned workers take that day shift and more new workers take that evening shift. What do you guys think about, like, just this difference that I found in this study that looked at 284 nurses in the VA between 2007 to 2010?
All right, so most violence occurs in the evenings, you said, right?
Yes.
All right, so I think
physical violence, by the way, physical instance of violence.
All right, so I think one of the factors is that during daytime hours, especially in inpatient units, there's more staff members present. Mm-hmm. You have the entire clinical team there, but oftentimes, like 5 p.m., the typical American workday, right? I'm just going to use that as an example. A lot of the staff members will head out, and then it's the evening team, right? Mm-hmm. And although it is still properly staffed, there's not as much eyes on the unit at that time. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to get into a discussion about the different types of violence that we have. Mm-hmm. There's 3 main different types of violence, right? There's what we call impulsive violence. You just have low frustration tolerance. I tell you, oh, Logan, you're looking especially angry today. Mm-hmm. And you're just so mad you can't control yourself. You just punch me in the face. Right? Impulsive. There's psychotic violence. So these are patients, maybe they have auditory hallucinations. They're like, yo, you got to punch this guy or the devil is going to stab you in the gut. Right. Some crazy stuff like that. Right? And then there's this other type of violence, which accounts for 17% of violence, which is called psychopathic. So this is the type of person that's premeditated, planning out and being very calculated, and even maybe like a revengeful type of violence, like, oh, this nurse didn't get me my ice cream on time, so I'm gonna get her. And unfortunately, what I've seen happen from time to time is these patients, after they've been there for a few days, they know what time certain staff members leave. They know what time the unit gets kind of quiet and kind of empty. And unfortunately, I feel like they look for an opportunity to strike. And maybe it just so happens, during those evening hours, due to staffing issues, they may just be a best time if somebody was choosing to go down a path like that.
Yeah. It's crazy.
It's scary.
Crazy to think about that. But I feel like, at least bringing these things to light, releasing them to our, I think it's millions of listeners at this point, right? Millions of listeners.
Tens of millions.
Yeah, bringing this up to our millions of listeners that, hopefully we can all advocate for changes in the hospital. Like I said earlier, every one of us is going to be eventually in a more leadership role in a healthcare organization. It certainly doesn't feel that way right now. So look, we've talked to you, Rupa, about this topic for a very long time. We appreciate all your time on this topic. What are your final thoughts?
I'm going to bring in some optimism. I really think that this is something that many departments, many people can come together and really find that great boundary of that ideal boundary of patient care and keeping everyone safe. I think as long as each one of us takes ownership and kind of self-regulates ourselves and kind of, again, goes back to, trusting your gut and bringing up these issues and talking to staff and understanding what they're going through, and not just like writing off the nurses as being, annoying or petty or whatever it may be, right? Kind of acknowledging those, and then, just having open discussion, I think can go a lot more a lot more than we think it can. I think as residents, sometimes we're overwhelmed with our work. I mean, I've definitely felt overwhelmed with the work and stuff like that, where I kind of forget, right? That, even if the change isn't made, at least I can bring it up, or I can at least support the nurses, right? After witnessing attack, I really went out of my way to talk to all the nurses, letting them know that I know how they feel and that I appreciate them. So I always walk out, I always appreciate the text now. And I think little things like that make people feel more supported. And if that's the least I can do at this point, making people feel like, the residents and administration know, then that's what I'm going to get out of it. And then continue to have those coming with my colleagues and talking about, certain ways that we can address and maybe standardize the care that we have at units. So that's my take on it.
I love the optimism. That's exactly why we brought you on, to balance out our negativity.
Yeah, I'm a total, no, I'm not gonna say that. All right, good episode.
Thanks
Cheers.
so much, Dr. Gill. We appreciate you.